Guten Abend, liebe Gästinnen, Gäste. Gästinnen sagt man als Französin, die Deutsch in Frankreich gelernt hat, nicht. Aber das muss man gewöhnen. Liebes Publikum, freue mich sehr, dass Sie hier da seid. Mein Name ist Benedikt Savoy und meine Rolle besteht ausschließlich darin, Hallo zu sagen und dann das Mikrofon an die wirklichen Heldinnen und Designerinnen und Kuratorinnen dieses Abends weiterzugeben. Und das sind Julie Hoang und Freya Doktor, seit gestern Freya Schwachenwald.
And thank you, Benedict. I will switch to English now because our event is in English. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Li Huang. I am curating together with Freya Schwachenwald this event series. And I just wanted to say hello also to our guests, and tell you that normally Freya would be on the screen explaining to us what's the topic about of the event, but she's in real life here today and just defended her thesis. And that's why I would just give her the floor and welcome back.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. And thank you all for coming. I will also keep it very brief and just introduce you to the brain and the heart behind tonight, because that's not us, that's Maarten Lagarde, who's also going to be hosting this discussion. A few words about Maarten. Maarten is a research and teaching associate as well as PhD candidate here at our Department of Art History as Cultural History at Technische Universität Berlin since 2020. And his research deals with the topic of community, activism, art, pictorial and performative reactions to HIV/AIDS in Berlin in the 1980s and 1990s. He studied German literature, theater sciences and art history and obtained his bachelor's as well as master's degree at Technische Universität Berlin. From 2017 to 2020, Maarten Lagarde's worked as research coordinator of the research cluster Dislocations and edited together with Benedikt Savoy and Philippa Sissis Beute ein Bildatlas zum Kunstraum und Kulturerbe. At the same time, Maarten was one of the researchers who initiated this event series, KuK-Tuesdays. So tonight is really a full circle moment for Maarten, coming back on stage as our host. Please, have fun and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Lee, Freya, and Benedict, and a warm welcome from me to our guests and all of you who are also our guests. And I will kind of ease us into tonight with a little bit of an introduction. I want you to get to know our guests. I want to give you some ideas of what we thought in preparation of this conversation. And I want to start by saying that this is something we do as university, but we consider it a little bit outside university, so you should feel at ease, maybe a little bit sweaty because it's warm, and you should feel free to be a reactive audience. You don't have to be silent and make your notes to burst out your questions in the end. You can just react to the flow of the light as you please. And usually the focus of our department is more on provenance research, the history of collecting, art history understood as cultural history. So tonight we're going a little bit out of our comfort zone as a department, but very much to the heart of my comfort zone as a queer living and working in Berlin. And so maybe because each area of studies, and queer studies is no exception from that, comes with special vocabulary and concepts and so on and so forth. If you're not familiar with some of them, make yourself heard, and I'm sure we will all be happy to help you understand what we are talking about if you don't really get what we're trying to talk about. Okay, those were the starting points, and now I want to begin by saying that the archive in our evening tonight is like a point of connection, not only between us, but also between queer research and the research we do here at the department, because archives are super important. We started the reiteration of our KuK-Tuesdays 2 years ago with a session on the colonial archives. So tonight we're gonna look at queer archives and also at how a queer methodology can destabilize or decenter existing archives that are not necessarily queer in their nature. I have a few general thoughts on the archive that I will start off with, and then I will go into a round of introduction of our 3 guests. I will do that in the reverse order of how they will be presenting later on. And when we think of the archive as the place that keeps official records, as collections of historic records, then queer lives and the archive relate to each other through suffering, because historic records most of the time either criminalize queer lives or they pathologize queer lives. This has certainly changed with recent legislation like the Marriage Equality Acts all over the world and the decriminalization of homosexuality, but we still don't want to look at queer through this classic idea of the archive. So I thought a little bit, how does queer relate, except for the suffering, to existing big historic archives? And sometimes queer archives are a little bit like parasites within bigger archives. So you could think, for example, about artist estates that made their way into some museum collection or something like that, that could attest to queer life on its own terms. Or you could think of things like the ACT UP New York papers that are kept in the New York Public Library, or the European HIV/AIDS archive, which was a queer-driven research effort at the Humboldt University and is part of their digital repository. But our focus today is on queer archives that have grown out of queer community and that are maintained to this day by a queer community. And also, when we think about these archives, I wanna, and that's my only real research reference I wanna give you, we can think with the words of Anne Svakovic of them as archives of feelings, because they are archives that stem from the emotional involvement of either a queer or a group of queers with certain material and their intrinsic emotional need to keep these records. And that, I think, creates very special archives, and we're gonna try to tackle their nature a little bit in our conversation. The other thing, as I said in the beginning, is also that we want to look at how a queer research ethic, a queer research methodology can be a new way, a different way into existing archives. So what I'm going to do for the introduction round, which is happening now, is I'm going to go into my very own personal archive, and I've picked a picture for each of our guests that I'm going to show you, talk to you about, and relate to our guests, so you understand me, you understand our constellation a little bit better, and then we're going to go into a round of short inputs by our guests, which are followed by a discussion among us a little bit for like 2-3 rounds of questions. And then we're going to open up the floor to all of you. So whenever you have a question that doesn't need to be asked immediately, keep it for the end and ask it then. Okay, let's go. The first image is for Minette, which is over there. And this image is a view of my hallway at home. You're in my flat, that's what it looks like when you close the door behind you and look to the right. And what we want to focus on is the giant Barbie you see here. Because this is not a work by Minette, who is a painter, but it is a work that I connect very deeply with her. It is an artwork by the Berlin-based artist Ursula Dietz, and it was made for an exhibition at Barbie Deinhof's around about 2006, I would say, but I'm not sure because I haven't checked back, with the old flyers that I have at home. And Ursula made not only a series of these larger than life, she's almost 3 meters tall, Barbies for that exhibition at Barbie Deinhof's, but she also created little Barbie dolls for people that were part of the community that surrounded this bar and project space on Schlesische Straße. And I don't think Minette had a Barbie herself, but I am sure that Barbie Deinhof's is the place where we first crossed paths, where we first met, where we started to reconnect through different constellations and in different spaces throughout the last 20 years almost. And what I want to get at with the little Barbie dolls that Ursula created for the community that surrounded Barbies is that, in a sense, she has become an active archivist of that scene by creating these very unique artworks about people that surround it. And something very similar is something that I read into an ongoing series of Minette's that she's gonna show us some works of later, which is her portrait series of the queer bohème in Berlin. And this really is a living archive for me of the Berlin community. So Minette, I'm very happy that you're here tonight and that you're gonna talk to us about your work. And I also will give you the key facts of Minette's life that she gave us in her little bio. Minette has studied painting, illustration and photography at the Fachhochschule für Gestaltung in Bielefeld, and she's living and working as an artist in Berlin since 1995. Her work has been published, among others, in the catalog Gender Gap from the Schwules Museum in 2010, the Drag Kings book mit Bartkleber gegen das Patriarchat from 2007. Bartkleber is something like wig glue, but you use it to glue down your mustache. And also in the catalog Doing Gender from 2004. She has exhibited, or her work has been exhibited ever since the mid-90s in numerous exhibitions all over Germany, but also in Vienna and Vancouver. And I've picked a few solo exhibitions quite randomly because I've either seen them or connected to them. Just last year, she showed parts of her Queer Berlin Bohème series at Eisenherz, which is another cornerstone of the queer community in Berlin, a bookshop in Schöneberg. She's had a show called Monkey Business at Pink Art Berlin in 2022, and she was also part of the group show Alle Workers Pals at Berghain in 2011, which I enjoyed a lot, and that's why I included it in this roundup. She's exhibited under the title Gender Gap with Sadie Lee at the Schwules Museum Berlin and at Studio XX Berlin with a show titled Sad Erotics, Guilty Pleasures in 2007. And that one I mentioned because Studio XX Berlin was a project space of the organizer of Barbie Deinhoffs, where we first met Lena Braun. Welcome, Minette. The second image comes from a different part of my archive, which is my camera roll on my iPhone. It's the image of Alessandra, who's here to my right, and that image is something like an emergency solution, because I couldn't find the image that I was actually looking for, which is if you know research in archives or research in general, and this like, I know this image exists, but where is it? That moment was happening when I was looking for Alessandra's picture, but let me tell you the connection first. So, in the winter of 2019, I was able to do a field trip with my work, which was back then already here at the Department for Art History as Cultural History. And this 5-day study field research trip was a very intense 5 days, where we've been to big ethnographic museums in Europe. We've started in Frankfurt, went to Cologne, we've been to Stuttgart, we went to Tervuren in Belgium, and ended our trip in Amsterdam at the World Museum. And this really was the culminating, at least in my recollection, the culminating part of that field trip, because we finally entered a museum that seemed to at least sincerely try to do things very much differently. Like, we've seen critical exhibitions throughout these 5 days, and all of them were super interesting, but the World Museum in Amsterdam was a different caliber of sorts, and I think a big part of why it is unique in the European ethnographic museum landscape is because of the Research Center for Material Culture, which is basically a nexus and a research nexus of the museum that is outside of the museum, and therefore can connect the research world of academic research from universities with curatorial research from the museum. Because if you are in, like, somewhere in the field of the history of collections or art history, you will know that these are the two major outlets for knowledge production in our fields, but oftentimes they are next to each other, or they don't talk with each other, or they are not linked to each other. And at least from the outside looking in, the Research Center of Material Culture manages to bridge that gap with cutting edge and critical research. And Alessandra has been involved with one of their big, it's always like long projects that take years, and this was a 5-year effort, if I'm not mistaken, that was called Unengendering the Collections. So I'm happy to have you here and hear you talk about your project, and I also have your bio here with us that I'm going to read for you now. Alessandra Benedetti Cotton is university docent at the University of Amsterdam's Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis, as well as adjunct associate professor at the City College of New York, where she maintains an affiliation to the Center for Worker Education, an institution to whose pedagogical model she is extremely dedicated. She is co-book reviews editor for the Journal of Haitian Studies, with Marie-José Negou-Tayo. I hope I didn't do too much injustice to that name. And a board member of the Haitian Studies Association. Most recently, she is co-editor on Rethinking Gender from the Ethnographic Museum with Journal of Material Culture and online with the Research Center of Material Culture. Which brings me to a very warm welcome to you as well. Which brings me to our last guest, our third guest of the evening, which is Heiner Schulze. And to introduce Heiner, I didn't find something in my personal archive, so I went to Google. And I found that image, which I'm gonna situate a little bit. It is not how you will see Berlin's Schwules Museum, so the Gay Museum of Berlin, if you go to it today, but it is how the Schwules Museum welcomed you in a time frame of 1988 to 2013, which is the longest time that this institution has existed. It is a Berlin backyard, as we know them all if we're around in the city, and this backyard is on Mehringdamm, a big street in Kreuzberg, Mehringdamm 61 to be exact. And this place, in that time, was something like a spatial concentration of queer Berlin, because not only the Schwules Museum was in that location, but when you walk up to that house from the street, you will find the Café and Bar Melita Sundström, named after a super important political drag artist in Berlin that died, I don't know.
In the mid-90s.
Yeah, in the mid-90s, of AIDS-related complications. And this is like a meeting place for queer Kreuzberg up to this day. It's the only part of this queer concentration in Berlin that still is in that place today. Now, if you crossed Melita Sundström and went in the basement through the back, you were in Schwutz, which is also not there anymore, but now in my neighborhood, actually, in Neukölln. And while the museum was in that parterre situation, the archive was somewhere upstairs in the Seitenflügel, the side wing of this building structure. And next to the archive was the AHA, which is the Allgemeine Homosexuelle Arbeitsgemeinschaft, a very important group that did community building, but also activist work that was involved with establishing queer sport clubs in Berlin and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of queer power in that building, and you can find traces of that queer power there still today. And it is also one of my first active Berlin memories, because in like 2001 or something, I was on a class trip to Berlin, and because my French teacher was gay, he took us to the gay museum, and we spent a whole day not only looking at the exhibition, but also being shown parts of the library and the archival collections that are really, like, if I come back to this idea of queer archives being archives of emotion that I told you in the beginning of my introduction, then you can sense it, you can feel it there in the nature of the material that you find in there. So I'm very happy that Heiner Schulze is here as a representative of the Schwules Museum Berlin, and I will wrap up my introduction and give him the word by reading out his bio. Heiner Schulze is a social scientist living in Berlin. Heiner currently works as a researcher and project manager at the Gender and Technology Center of the Berlin University of Applied Sciences and Technology. Hannah's work centers on social structures and inequality, processes of diversification in institutions, as well as questions of memorialization, in particular in relation to East Germany, queer histories, and HIV/AIDS. Since 2016, Heiner has been serving as member of the board of directors of the Schwules Museum in Berlin. In this capacity, Heiner's focus at the museum has been supporting the archive and library as well as the museum's extensive event program. Heiner has furthermore been project manager and curator for several exhibitions, the most recent one being HIV, so HIV isolated and archived, a search for traces, which explored the diversity of the museum's HIV/AIDS collections, looking for traces of groups, topics, narratives, and experiences of HIV and AIDS that have received little or less attention in the practices of collecting and exhibiting. In addition to that, Heiner is also a member and former co-chair of the Expert Advisory Board of the Federal Foundation Magnus Hirschfeld. In 2023, Heiner was a fellow for the Diverse and Inclusive Culture of Remembrance program, a reciprocal transatlantic exchange program for individuals with a professional interest in the promotion of an inclusive and progressive culture for remembrance in public spaces in Germany and the United States. Welcome, Heiner. And I will give you the little TV thing to start your input for us.
Yes. Thank you for inviting the museum. I'm happy to be here. And yes, I want to start here. And actually, I'm also thinking about the topic and about the event. I was thinking about the conditions of queer lives, queering, which differentiate them from other forms of archives. And I actually also went back to Anne Svetkovich and the Archive of Feelings, and the book of the Archive of Feelings is a wonderful book, very inspiring. And in the beginning, in the introduction, she talks about some of the conditions of queer lives, and where she very much emphasizes how there are always, or often, queer lives or queer experiences are forged around sexuality and intimacy, which is something which also when looking at archives you always have to remember, and how the experience of queer people is very much also often linked, and is an experience which is of privacy, of marginalization and invisibility, both of which can be chosen, but which are also often enforced upon us. And because of these conditions, the traces where you can actually, if you're looking for archives, if you're looking for traces of queer people, they are often very ephemeral or unusual. And there is very much this absence of institutionalized documentations, or they're often in opposition to the official histories, because a lot of the traces of queer life are or were consciously actually destroyed by queer people themselves because they didn't want to be found out. They were destroyed by their non-queer descendants, which unfortunately is still taking place today. Some got simply destroyed by the disinterest by dominant society, and some traces are basically kind of invisibilized because people are just less able to read and interpret them because they can be so coded, and if the people who know the codes are gone, we might not recognize that these are the traces actually we're kind of looking for. And so so you can see in queer archives often the ephemeral and the personal collections of objects stand very much alongside documents of the dominant cultures, which are very much linked to criminalization, medicalization, etc. And so what I think that a lot of queer people and queer archives do is kind of searching and offering alternative modes of knowledge and actually what we have and what we are searching for. And also the gay museum, the queer museum, is kind of linked also to these queer lives, and it was founded in 1985 kind of as a glimpse of what could be, because it was based, or before that there was an exhibition at the Berlin Museum, which does not exist anymore. It was a city museum where they did an exhibition on actually queer lives in Berlin. And so they could see it was a really successful exhibition. It had the most visitors the museum ever had during its run. And it showed a lot of queer people that there is queer life, and that we are worthy of being in places, in museums. But at the same time, it was also an experience of erasure, because after the, like I said, most successful exhibition the museum had, they were like, okay, now the exhibition is over, we have all of this stuff which you collected, like, we don't want this. Like, either we throw it away or we take it. And that was how the museum was founded, because our founding mothers, how we call them, were saying like, what the fuck, like, you can't just throw that away. So we just, had the audacity to create our own institution. And so the Gay Museum was founded. And there's a quote by Birgit Bosold, one of our board members, which I like, and which I'm going to read to you, where she kind of explains the impetus of the museum. And it says, it was founded as a subcultural anti-museum to challenge the hegemonical interpretation and prerogative of classical historical political institutions and the systematic exclusion of homosexual histories and cultures from collections and exhibition practices. The SMU's DNA is marked by a rootedness in the social movement and a reference to alternative experiences not represented in the mainstream museum to non-canonical wild knowledge. So there are a lot of important aspects in there, and I think like the museum and queer archives and queer institutions in general are very much a challenge to these hegemonical, heteronormative institutions and understandings of the world. The idea behind the museum, which still until today, is to address the systematic exclusion of queer their stories and cultures. But this also necessitates that we develop further and still look further into, okay, who's marginalized now? Also what is in the quote very much is that the museum and its history is very much rooted in communities and movement. Like Matt said, we've been together with all of these other institutions because we've been part of this community. And so for queer archives and for us, there's always a somewhat shared understanding and identity, politics, as well as very much an emotional complexity. And also what's in the quote is what is important for us is that we are also especially looking for these alternative experiences, for the non-canonical wild knowledge. And we acknowledge in our work, we have to acknowledge the ephemeral nature of queer experiences. So how do we do that actually in practice and everyday life? Of course, our focus is on queer their stories, culture, art, everyday life. We're the biggest institutions of that kind worldwide. Our goal is kind of to preserve, to exhibit, to explore, and we do that through through exhibitions primarily. I think that's the most visible part for a lot of people, which range from historical to art exhibitions, from people to movements, to concepts, to experiences. We also have an archive, a physical archive, which houses around 1.5 to 2 million individual artifacts, from flyers to dildos to videos to everything you can imagine. And we are visited by researchers from all over the world, but we are not the first queer archive in Berlin. I think this is important to say that actually the Spinnboden, the lesbian archive, existed, I think, like almost a decade longer than we do. And it's actually a wonderful place, you should definitely go there. And we also have to fulfill our trifecta with a library, which is a working space and also a source of knowledge. And actually, my first experience to go to the museum was actually in the library because there were literature which you could not find in the Berlin University libraries. Actually, I had a really terrible experience there my first time. I never thought I'd go back, but it's another story. And in our everyday life and work, we work a lot inside of the institution. We do a lot of our exhibitions themselves from inside of the institution, but we also cooperate with outside groups and institutions. We consult other institutions. Some of our exhibitions are together with outside groups. Of course, a lot of our work is going on inside of the space of the museum, but we also go out. So there were tours. We have several audio walks now through the city. We do sometimes events outside. We get out as networks. We created a network for queer archives in German-speaking countries. But, I say this word queer a lot, so what do we actually mean? Queer as in, of course, our understanding about us queer basically is an umbrella term for identities and experiences of gender and sexual minorities. At the same time, there's this quote which I took from our mission statement, which understands queer as a critical practice that challenges not only heterosexual dominance and binary gender norms, but all forms of discrimination and exclusion. And this understanding as critical practice is something which I think, some of you might disagree, but I think we take that quite seriously. And for us, this means the sensitivity to the ephemeral, because as we know, queer life has always been very much defined by that. We also, I think, understand ourselves as an unhappy archive, in the sense as it requires a critical reflection on the processes of integration and a critical reflection and critical analysis of the simplified progress narratives, which often invisibilize the back and forth of history, the instabilities and the ambiguities of lived experiences. I think what is also important for us in our work, in our exhibitions, in our archive is to emphasize the fragility and the contextuality of identities and categories. They are not fixed. They've never been fixed. They're in constant flux. And it's necessary to pay attention to the historical discontinuity of concepts and practices, and also to the exclusions which certain identities, categories, practices are always accompanied by. And also very much linked to that is we have an emphasis on the heterogeneity of experiences, so it's not the gay man, and also to take a look of in a way of an intersectional way. And also, I think what is also very important, because it's always linked to feelings, I think critical practice for us is also that we also search for potentiality for a different, for a better future, for queer utopia, as Munoz said it, I think. And to finally slowly come to the end. So I understand us as an archive, in a sense as it's a physical space where stuff is. So it's a social space where people can gather, but also I often say it's also an arsenal. It's an arsenal of experiences, of identities, of concepts, of movement history, of demands, of political demands, of experiences, where people can tap into and acquire it and use it for their own goals, for their own whatever they want to do with it. And as an institution, I think in our work we want to do 6 things. As an institution, part of the social movement, we want to further representation. After all, that's how kind of also we've been founded. We want to represent all kinds of queer identities. We want to empower all sexual and gender deviants against the heteronormative and cis-normative society. We want to very much deconstruct actually norms, identities, categories, and exclusions. We also emphasize cooperation and participation. inside of the museum and also with outside communities. A lot of our recent exhibitions have been in cooperation with people the exhibitions are on. So now we have a current exhibition on sex work, which is curated by sex workers. Also, one of our aspirations is reflection, constant reflection, also further development of our institutions. We started as a gay, cis, men, bourgeois institution. Now we are much more and try to encompass the whole queer experience. And also, I think very much it's important as a queer archive to have an acknowledgement of failure. Because, of course, we are somewhat of an anti-museum, but at the same time, we are institutionalized, we are norm-breaking as well as norm-making. And in the end, we can never be queer enough. And with that, I'm done.
I will keep my questions for the end, because I want first that we hear from all of our guests. And then, so I will say, we'll give the floor straight to Alessandra.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to time it because it's 15 minutes, so you have your expectations. And the reason it's 15 minutes is because it's a huge project. And I'm here representing a lot, so I did choose. Also, I am known in my classes here in Europe to be understood as chaotic, so if you want the 4 takeaways at the end, I'm happy to give them to you, but hopefully you'll absorb them. I also very much am thrilled to be here, but I also didn't want to be here. I tried very hard not to be the one because I'm an excellent project manager. That's the only thing I can say I'm excellent at. And the 2 people with whom I co-edited, and I'll speak about them in a second, just couldn't be here today. And so I was very honest, and you were very welcoming despite the honesty. So I'm going to go into it, and hopefully I represent properly. There is one part that we'll cut from the video, and I'll just indicate to you what that is. And the reason for that is questions of respectability, and I don't want them to travel beyond the intimacy of this group. So in the 10 minutes, or 15 minutes, I speak today, we, for Josep Almudever Chansa and Wagne who are present here in my voice, reflect on gender. Specifically, what is possible if we better carry the presence of the epistemological through materiality, especially materiality of the human body, and in the cases of some of the article's arguments, to the material expressions of how mind-soul presses itself upon and pulses through the body as human body, as beingness is embodied in territorio, and as the art pieces that body comes into contact with within this territorio. Both those contributors who were familiar with gender theory and those who shied away from it in engaging this project found Judith Butler's work on performativity and Jose Esteban Muñoz's thinking on disidentification extremely compelling. And yet perhaps one of the most crucial moments in the extremely collaborative and vexed editorial process among Josep, Wagne, and myself was when, terrified, I finally just expressed clearly what, as a scholar thinking alongside scholarship in Haitian voodoo, did not sit well with me in gender studies. Namely, the rather often said, often assumed strict division between gender studies and the studies of sexuality. Said otherwise, while they must and should be thought about differently, how much of this division is predicated on the whole that is the post-Aquinas European Enlightenment subject, which takes as its predetermined starting point the one-to-one relationship between one soul and increasingly secular mind and one human body. What happens when either in early Christian Nestorianism or, for example, in Haitian Vodou, this initial entity has multiple components, and the human body literally serves as a container, a materiality for these to pass through. For example, there are at least 2 component parts which pass through the body in Haitian Vodou. One associated with the personality, in Vodou, the Jeanne-Ange, mostly associated with the body in question, in Haitian Vodou, the colonial, and the other as a part and parcel of the greater soul of the universe, in Haitian Vodou, the Guobonange. Does Muñoz's Caribbeanness, his familiarity with regla de ocho, in fact afford him a given intellectual environment in which his notions of disidentification can emerge as theoretical possibilities? And is not then the behaviors one performs with and through one's body, including those behaviors which many read as sexuality, also related to soul work? To be more clear about it, what happens when a person understood as female in their co-cadav is mounted by a spirit who is understood as male, or even as gender fluid, when this co-cadav, this body that is receptacle, understood as male, welcomes a female spirit, or a more fluidly gendered spirit into its body? Then, in Western terminology, which gender has this person become? Are they marked by this regendering? How does their body carry traces of this holding of another mind soul in their co-cadav? When is this action sexualized, and how? These are largely unanswerable questions, but they do shed light on what it means to think through another epistemological lens. And in the case of many of the contexts offered out in the articles that emerged from the volumes, they are more a reflection upon what it means to think through the varying layers when one discourse hegemonizes not just another, but many other layers. Okay, I have it upside down. This very short initial discussion sets the scene for what follows, which is a focus on praxis, how we made it so joyfully through such vexed terrain, for this was a World Museum project and each article dealt with a specific scholarly field, an area study, many of which are just not as carefully theorized and re-theorized as Vodou studies have been in the last years. In the 5-year process that was this project, the articles that are part of the Unengendering the Collections research, an idea that came from my predecessor, Kari Nakamura, and Wayne Modest, my former boss and friend and mentor and amazing human, asked that we honor how malleable notions of gender are, based on the importance of what it means to, in Wayne Modest's terms, dignify an object, an artifact, and how such dignity means a constant openness to what a word might mean at any given moment in time. In recent correspondence with the last of the article's writers, Diego Semerene, she writes that in thinking any terminology, especially those linked to identity, we might consider a term and its given definition as, and I quote, opening for these discussions to be animated and to percolate our pedagogical interactions. Ironically, though, committing things to the word can crystallize them in a way that is antithetical to their kinetic tendencies. End quote. Each of the contributors called into this project were asked to think of at some level outside their respective specializations and to grapple with, in some cases, intense pushback from the peer reviewers, especially in the case of those articles published by the Journal of Material Culture. And so this is where it would stop. But Timothy Carroll, the editor-in-chief, and Razvan Nicolescu, the managing editor, quietly and in unsaid ways worked as go-betweens, massaging out what was needed to get the articles to publication. Without the contributors' courage, openness, humility, and commitment to the process that is slow scholarship, without the peer reviewers' generous attention, as shocking as it sometimes was to those like ourselves brought up in gender and queer studies, such an interdisciplinary project could never have taken place. And so in July 2023, we launched 8 articles. In January 2024, released 3 more, and alongside the articles in the Journal of Material Culture, which was released in December 2023. Most importantly, the project took place because of how both co-editors, Wonu and Josep, chose to constantly de-escalate any given hot moment. And at each turn, we settled into the methodological slowness of knowing we could indeed assist the authors or ourselves for our introduction, find articulation that neither compromised what we were meant to represent, yet also made it more readable to those still incapable or unwilling to think in otherwise ways. Ultimately, we were not preaching to the choir, but had to find a way, and thanks to years of working under Wonu Vey's and Wayne Modest's respective aegises, they had modeled for us how to slow it all down and de-escalate it without compromising it. We all three agreed that Josep would have been the best person to be here among us today, but he is conducting research. Next slide, yeah. In his village of birth, where one of the most important events of Marian worship takes place. He sends his regret, and very caringly they both buttress me, a mother, into coming today, reminding me that perhaps one of the first and most queer relationships we each have, healthy or unhealthy, is that to our mother. The way mother-child relations nurture often the most courageous expressions of justice-oriented queer thought comes out in two of the articles contributed to the volumes. And if you could go back to Wagne, I guess it's the next one. Go back. Yeah. And Wagne is a curator at the museum. She will be here in October. She's a specialist of Oceania, and she continues to be a curator, but she was just named a bijzonder hoogleraar Art and Material Culture of Oceania at Leiden University. And he took on his task with such care, reading all the works on this chaotic slide suggested to him, and deferred with grace and gratitude to the peer reviewer's suggestions. To note, this was an article for our volume, so we chose the peer reviewers. And it is perhaps in the process of this particular article that as editors, we realized how quickly and with care two seemingly opposite critical practices can complement each other. In the last slides, which I work through quickly and to which we can return, I want to mention again those to whom we are indebted as a project, and who modeled this work of de-escalating by allowing all parties involved to feel comfortable with what Wayne Modest has referred to as the courage to abandon our exhausted narratives, even when these narratives, even now or at one point in time, still feel radical and justice-oriented. Maybe there is another way to achieve justice than just repeating the same narrative over and over again. Here, Yuki Kihara, and then her working with Eliza Steinbach and Liang Kai-Yu in the article they wrote about her artwork, and then 14 slides, 14, the next three, was crucial in calling us all into thinking about how trans studies in some instances imposes itself as yet another Western discursive value system that reads onto rather than alongside what is really happening in any given moment and place, and epistemological circumstance. For as Tao and Morgan in 2002 argued, Euro-informed gender theory is itself an imprint of a specific cultural norm, and I quote, "If gender is determined by culture elsewhere, then it must be determined by culture at home too." The challenge then is to work towards a scholarly language that can, with what Wayne Modest terms critical discomfort, not so much translate, but craft specific epistemology that is itself readable to those who might not before have been capable of being communicated to. But this means letting ourselves be humble to the ever-expanding multiplicities of the varying locations of culture from which we emerge, move, and transform. Not one of the authors, and there were many, I think there were 23 in the end, ever was a diva. Everybody was an absolute humility. It was the most beautiful experience I've ever been involved in academically, while accepting that there shall never be a right, universal way to write about gender. Or as Lucas Avendaño noted in a stunning event that now Berlin's Spohr-based Magdalena Wiener co-curated. And finally, Diego Semerene, whose words I began my presentation with, wrote the last piece for our volume. If Semerene's research and teaching has paid deep attention on what it means to love, where intimacy fits into, if intimacy fits into love, and how, if at all, and how childhood prepares us to perhaps expect love, then Semerene's last work, in the way she so quietly poses questions so that we come to realize not so much that we necessarily learn anything specifically, any specific formulated message, but rather we just realize. Semerene was touched by how these artworks, objects at the so-called ethnographic museum sat on digital space, a list of photos with item numbers, which for Semerene could not but be imprints of the private, quotidian, non-quotidian, spiritual, and even sexual lives of those with whom the object once lay. Semerene's article, Embarrassing Subjects, Undisplayable Objects of Possible Encounters Between Trans and Cis That Have Nonetheless Taken Place, then mimics the Ethnographic Museum's website, featuring objects from her own trans girl life, reminding us that looking at what is not of our lived intimate life is more than voyeurism, a reflection on our inability to give love to those who deserve and most need love at any given moment in time. And the Ethnographic Museum, without the love that went into articles such as these, still remains a space where lovelessness is displayed in ways that Semerene reminds us remains so unbelievably lonely and painful. And I end there, but just to explain Semerene's article, she takes objects from lovers who have left objects behind, like identity cards, chewing gum, and she keeps them over years, and she brought them to Europe after living in Los Angeles and knew she wanted to do something with them. And after she saw how objects were displayed on the Ethnographic Museum website, she thought, this is my voyeurism into somebody else's intimate life, so then I have the right for others to see the lovelessness in my life. So that was,
So now it's my turn. Back to Earth. I grew up thinking there were not really much female artists. My trustworthy art lexicon just provided me with 10 women for 800 years of art history. And we all know the reasons. And I thought what to do about. And I gave myself the task to, whenever I stumbled across a contemporary female artist and I had a portrait photo of her at hand, I would like to make sort of a star postcard and collect them all, just know them. Who are they? What do they look like? What's their name? Because it was very easy for me to come up with male artist names. And I just felt the lack of females. So then I collected them, and I think I need role models. It's really important for me to be among females. So I called the series My Ancestors, and the photo shows my ancestors displayed in a show in Schwules Museum. The show was Lesbische Sehen, and not all of the artists are lesbians. I don't know how many at all. That wasn't my focus at that time, but that set something going. And I thought about female artists in history and remembered a book I read as a student. It was Renate Berger, Kunstgeschichte als Sozialgeschichte, Art History as Social History. And Renate Berger focused on all the obstacles that came across a female planning to have an artistic career. It starts with no university would take them. They had to be supported by the family. They hadn't possibilities to own their own houses, create studios, have their own money. It seemed even how you have to dress to be regarded as a proper dressed woman was an obstacle in a female artist's life. And Renate Berger mentioned examples. I remember, for instance, Luise Seiler, who she said lived in Weimar and spent some time in Rome to do portrait works and was summoned back because her mother died and she had to do her father's household. And now, having the internet at hand, I rethought about this book and said, who was Luise Seiler? What did she do even? Do we know? And I researched her and found out that, in fact, the household of her father wasn't, he was the Hofstallmeister of the current region of that time, and she did not have to wash his socks or something, but tell the servants what to do. She was in contact with Goethe. She painted his portrait. She founded the first art collection of that time for this Herzog. And that shifted something in me. Up to that point, my regard for the past was, oh, the poor women. And then I thought, wait, there might have been some great artists who did stuff at their time who were recognized in their own worth, but then fall out of the canon. And so I said, I want to know more about them. I started with Louise. She had friends, and I very fast learned if you have one name, you very fast find others. Then I learned that there had been two places, especially in the 19th century. If you wanted to be a female artist and paint, you had to go to Paris, Académie Julian or Colarossi. If you wanted to do sculptures, you had to be in Rome. And no one name of that time, but you find lots of others. And I thought about, I could do a new portrait series about female artists in the past. And then it soon became way too overwhelming. I started by just writing down their names and their dates of life. And I'm now up to 1,500 names of female artists who are known, who did work, who have been collected, but then just fall out of the canon or would be shoved outside of the limelight. And then I thought, I can't do 1,500 portraits. How can I just make the range a bit smaller? And then I very soon realized, oh, if you are that independent to, for instance, go to Paris and study, there might have been more to find out. And I very often found one female who set up house with another female, and then those links in biographies like she never managed to find a husband, or she had a lifelong friend, and that made me curious. And in some instances, you really find the word lesbian. I also learned a new term. It is Boston marriage. It's coined by Henry James, who was in Rome when the sculptresses were there in greater numbers. He interacted with them and described them as the white Marmorian flock, and coined this term of the Boston marriage because many of these women came from Boston, came from educated families, were financially independent, and teamed up with another female because it's easier if you're not alone. So some of the women pairs I found might not be sexually attracted to each other. I don't know. But I thought I put that aside. I'm not a scientist, I'm just an artist. And I show you what I made. It's just a fraction of the whole. I made these tiny portraits of perhaps lesbian female artists of the 19th century, and I used a new technique. Normally I paint in oil on canvas, and a friend presented me with a collection of pigments from the Crema art pigment firm, and this collection especially is named the Ikonenmaler Sortiment. So the present was given to me with, but you are painting our icons. And so I thought, well, I could do a new series of portraits of lesbian artists of the 19th century and use this for me new technique, egg tempera, and painted their portraits, looked up whatever I could find about biographical details, and have shown them twice since. And I tried to, like the first slide, my ancestors, I tried to set them into relation, because many of them really knew each other, were at the same place at the same time or helped each other. It's the story about, what's her name again? No, Rosa Bonheur. Rosa Bonheur was so famous at her time that there have been dolls produced after her like this. She had a Genehmigung to wear trousers, which you had to have in France until, I don't know, 2002 or something. It wasn't prosecuted so long, but at Rosa Bonheur's time, if she would be picked up by the police not wearing a skirt, it could have been trouble. So she had this license. And after her appearance, there were dolls created, Rosa Bonheur dolls. And then there has been this girl, Anna Klunke, who had been presented with a Rosa Bonheur doll. And it was her role model. And she decided she wanted to become an artist so bad. Then she grew up, she became an artist. Then she visited Rosa Bonheur to paint her portrait. She did. But as well, she moved in with Rosa because Rosa just has lost her lifelong companion a year or two back. And then she really got to den Nachlass verwalten. That's one story. So they are really connected. But now to that's the past, and I'm actually not quite sure if it's okay to say lesbian artists of the 19th century, because I like to use the word lesbian because it really has a disruptive possibilities, and why not just take something? Then again, there has been, for instance, Gluck, and Gluck to that even at that time said no pronouns, no articles. It's just Gluck. So Gluck was Gluck, and I included Gluck, but well, there starts the difficulties. Then there are 2 or 3 more persons who nowadays perhaps would identify more as queer or something. So that's a difficulty. I'm not quite sure how to handle that. I switched to calling the series for me Freundin guter Kunst, which in a way I hate dropping the word lesbian, but I have to handle that. I leave it for now. So, but my main work, which I'm doing now for more than 20 years, this is me in my studio, is a series, a portrait series about the queer Berlin Bohem. And these portraits all are painted by life. The models come to me and we work together to get these portraits. We start with sketches to just try out positions, to try out how do we feel comfortable, how is it interesting for me, how is it just physically possible for the model to sit there and sit there for hours. We have to normally 5 times 3 hours to get the portrait done, and then the model's work is finished, and I start some sort of intuitive process for coming up with a background. In the last years there have been more and more animals accompanying the models, and now it often happens that the model comes to my studio and says, do you already know which animal you will give me? Or people just ask me for, could you paint me with my beloved cat, or I love monkeys so much, or wishes can be asked, and sometimes I comply. And I've just brought some more examples. This one is, what's it called again? Let me think about it. I'll just look it up. It's Where Does My Mind Reside? Featuring Ausgeh-Dörte. A funny thing about that. I've seen a documentary on TV about a bird called the Waldrapp, who was re-established in Germany, and I somehow made a little note to myself, Waldrapp, Hintergrund, Jan, and perhaps just because I thought the wig looked a little bit like the feathers of this Waldrapp, I don't know, but afterwards I researched about this bird, and the Waldrapp is belongs to the ibis family, and the ibis in Old Egypt was the accompanying animal of the god Thoth, and he was the god of writers. And this was Chefredakteur of Siegessäule, so I thought, well, that's a nice coincidence. Then we have a painting called Preach, featuring Stephanie Kuhn. And Stephanie Kuhn has the flows of the Medusa as a background. And this Medusa story is quite fascinating because that's too long to. I made it, I sent it to Stephanie, and Stephanie said, oh, did I tell you that I really have a deep connection to this exact painting? It's, she didn't tell me with words, but I think that's the magic of art that sometimes happens. This one is Cœur de Lion, featuring Linus Giese. Linus has written at least one book that many people have read. It's Mein Name ist Linus, and he is a trans man and wrote about his story. And this is the second portrait we made. It was his wish to pose naked, and the position he's in is playing with the Michelangelo David statue. And I thought I'd give him some accompanying lions, because you could use some cuddly strength, I think. Then we have Tales of Cats, featuring Christina Marleen. And I thought about Manet's Olympia. Christina is a sex worker, and Olympia was known as a sex worker, and the painting of Manet was a scandal at that time. And I just thought I wouldn't just copy the background, but take the element of the flower bouquet. And so I used some Flemish master, Rachel Rösch, and used a flower bouquet she has painted to put it in the background for Christina Marleen. And now the last one, it's What Else Can You Show Me, featuring Manuela Kai. I like this one very much. Manuela requested, she wanted to be painted without animals. She said, I don't feel a connection to animals. They may be in their space and me in mine. And I thought, okay, I could do that. I just gave her balloons. So, you can find nearly all of them on my blog, playgenderwordpress.com. So, thank you.
Okay, thank all three of you so much for making time to thinking about these inputs, bringing them to us. And I've had a little eye towards the clock, which says it's around 8, which means we usually say we take this to 8:30. We started a little late, so we have some leniency in the end. But what I want to make sure of is that you get as much room for questions as possible. So I will just ask one for each of you. and I've written them down while I was listening to your presentations, and while I was listening to you, Heine, I was thinking, you're talking to us about the history of this institution, which goes like to the mid-80s, and you're of a generation that hasn't been an active queer by that time, so you're of a younger generation, but like now not of the youngest queer generation, and me sorry, maybe not very flattering, but like me working in university with students in their early 20s, I oftentimes have this feeling or a very, very concrete like occurrences of getting to know the processual nature of queerness, that it's constantly changing and shifting, that what's queer today isn't queer tomorrow. So I wanna to ask you to talk a little bit about the behind the scene transgenerational work in what we must say, and you said it yourself, it's the biggest archived queer museum of its kind worldwide, so you're quite exposed and powerful, yet an institution that is driven by volunteers and lives under precarious financement, so it's not like your standing is reflected in the money and the workforce you have. So how does this transgenerational queer dialogue in some little practical words happen in your experience in the Schwules Museum in Berlin?
The transgenerational dialogue is, I think it's actually a topic we think about often in a way, because I mean, you're right, the museum is older than I am, but I am not the youngest anymore, as I also see when interacting with students. But I think the museum has it's very important as a transgenerational institution and device, because first it helps also a lot of younger queers to kind of find themselves as well as find their ancestors in a way. Like, I always have to think of this one memory of this one, like I was at an event at the museum and like walking around doing stuff, and there was always like this young guy who was maybe 17 training me, and at some point I was like, hey, what's up? And I asked him because I could see like there was something, and he was like, I don't know, can I ask you something? I was like, yeah, sure. And he was like, are you gay? I was like, probably when we're here. And I started a conversation with him, and like, for him, the existence of such a place was so freaking important, because he had nobody in his life he could talk to, but there he was, a place which was called Gay Museum, where he was like, I can feel there's something with me, and there are people who might be like me, and like for him it was important that such a place exists. And I think by now I know a lot of people, younger people as well as older people, who come to the space from a kind of trying to explore themselves and trying to find themselves. And there at the museum you can actually get also into contact with people from different generations. So for me, I did not have that much contact to queer people above, say, 40, 50, before I went there, because that was just not who was in the places I went to. But a lot of our volunteers are retired, kind of older generation, which has different experiences than I do, and which have a very much lived experience, which I can connect to in certain ways, and sometimes I struggle with about certain topics, but for me it was very much in place, and I know it's a lot for our volunteers for younger volunteers to actually get into this kind of transgeneration exchange. But also for the older generation of our volunteers, we have around 60, 70 volunteers in total. It's important for them to kind of feel a connection to younger people, to find also to a younger discourse, and to also learn and develop further, and to, like, we did workshops for the volunteers, primarily for the older volunteers, on trans people, on how to address gender identities, so they could also learn about that in a way. And so it can be a productive learning process for all kinds of people. But it also causes a lot of friction, because, you know, like the museum, it has diversified, it has expanded its scope, and not all of the volunteers and all of the members, like your membership association, are very happy about that. There was this older generation of primarily cis men who were very much against including lesbians, including trans people, including non-binary people, intersex people, and were, as you know, we had some fights in the press, we had people attacking us, we had people pulling their stuff from our archive because they were like, why are you doing that? Like, we're a gay museum. And we're like, no, if we take our founding impetus of focusing on exclusion and marginalization serious, we have to expand. And this has been quite I think this has been a generational struggle in a way, because in our experience, younger people are more, like, for them it's more normal to have a queer outlook than the older generation. But it caused a lot of friction with us. But I think, like, in general, in the majority of times, this transgeneration experience has been very important, especially when looking to HIV/AIDS. Also, a lot of, like, there's a lot of people who got lost, and in contrast to a lot of other institutions, it's harder for queer people to have, like, kind of this linear ancestry, because there is so much more missing. And so an institution like ours, which sometimes fosters transgeneration exchange, I think that's something which I like, and which I hope we could also do more, to bring people more together from different experiences and see them that they're still, like, they have some similar experiences and some are different, and sometimes it's also good for younger people to realize, like, oh, what, like, the activists did 40 years ago, like, it's something I can learn from, because I think also in the younger generation there's a kind of ignorance sometimes about our own queer histories.
Thank you. Alessandra, when I was listening to your presentation, which showed us, like, in some case studies, the multifaceted and multi-layered way that you had to think gender concepts within doing the research project, I was very much thinking, okay, but you're focusing on research outcome, but I wonder, and if it has, how the project also changed the museums and the way they work or see themselves? So is there like a queer, like an active queering process of the way the museum understands itself within the time frame of the project or afterwards? I think afterwards you're like working in a different capacity, so maybe you can't speak so much about that. But while doing the project, and I know that it's very wholesome projects that have very different formats and ways to engage not only the public but also the museum itself. Okay, then Minette, while I was listening to you, I was thinking the whole time, where are your archives to locate the lesbian artists of the past. So I just like very practical, like in your research project for that new series, where did you go to? Where did you end up? Where did the research take you? Is it books only? Is it the online? Is it actual archives? Yo.
The worlds of the internet, of course. It's very helpful because actual archives are time-consuming, and I regard myself more as an artist than as a researcher. So I just open the internet and type in a name, and then I'm lost for hours because one leads to the other. So I'm really relying there. I use my catalogs, and I go to exhibitions, and then I have new names on my plate, but mostly it's the internet.
Okay, thank you.